When I first stepped into Jason's house, it felt like I had entered another world. Huge glass windows, spacious halls, and expensive furniture. Everything looked so luxurious, so out of reach for someone like me. I always knew Jason was a successful man. He had built a career that others could only dream of, and every aspect of his life reflected that success. But amidst all of it, I felt like a guest at someone else's party. My parents always taught me to be modest, to suppress my emotions, and to not draw attention to myself. Live for others, not for yourself, my mother would say. And with those words, I entered this marriage. I was the perfect wife, always ready to step back and support him, asking nothing in return. And though I truly loved Jason, I felt like I was losing myself in the process, disappearing into his world. The thought that I wasn't measuring up to his life never left me. Every day, I watched how confidently he moved through life, while I felt like I was fading. I feared that one day he would realize I didn't belong in his world, that I wasn't worthy of it. Jason was kind to me. He made sure I was comfortable, but he always remained emotionally distant. I felt he was never really interested in what I was feeling, what was going on inside me. We talked about dinner, his business, but never about my inner world. And when I was alone in this huge house, surrounded by luxury that I couldn't enjoy, I often found myself wondering, what is my role in this life, and what comes next? I remember the evening when Jason casually mentioned that his son Ryan would be returning home soon. "You probably haven't had the chance to meet him. He's rarely around," he said while flipping through some papers at dinner. It seemed like an insignificant detail at the time. Ryan was part of a life Jason never shared much about. I had heard of him, but never wondered what he was like. It felt distant, irrelevant to me. When the day of Ryan's return finally arrived, I felt a slight sense of anticipation. Deep down, I was curious to meet the person who was so important to Jason, yet spoken of with such indifference. Maybe I hoped his arrival would bring something new into this house, add a bit of color to our life. When Ryan stepped through the door, I immediately sensed his confidence. Tall, lean, with piercing eyes, he looked like he wasn't just coming home but reclaiming his place in the world. He smiled at me, and there was something so captivating in that smile that I momentarily lost my composure. Jason gave his son a brief hug, as if they hadn't been apart for years, but just a few days. I stood off to the side, feeling awkward at their cool reunion. Ryan moved towards me, and before I could say anything, he spoke. "You must be Emma. It's nice to finally meet you." His voice was deep and assured. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of unease growing inside me. He looked at me as if he had known me for a long time, and it made me feel exposed. From that moment on, I began to notice his attention. He often stopped by the room I was in, tried to draw me into conversations, even if I responded briefly. His smiles, compliments, and light jokes all seemed harmless, but every time our eyes met, I felt a tension building inside me. I couldn't understand why Ryan's presence unsettled me so much. Perhaps it was his confidence, something I lacked, or maybe it was his piercing gaze that seemed to see right through me. But the more I tried to avoid his attention, the more I found myself drawn to it. Ryan was persistent. He always found a reason to talk to me, even when I timidly stepped back. He didn't allow me to hide behind my usual shyness. After Ryan's return, I began noticing him around more often. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. We'd run into each other in the kitchen, the garden, or by the pool. He always found some excuse to talk to me. His words were casual, as if there was no tension between us. But I felt it. Every time he glanced my way, I froze. And inside, a strange mix of embarrassment and curiosity began to grow. He complimented me in a way that seemed so natural. "You look lovely today, Emma," he'd say as he passed by. And though there was nothing inappropriate in his words, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them. I kept telling myself it was just friendly attention. After all, I was his father's wife, and nothing more could come of this. But each time he got too close, each time his hand brushed against mine, I felt a tremor inside. That small touch, barely noticeable, seemed to stir something deep within me. I tried to avoid him. I kept our conversations short and made sure we weren't alone for too long. But it was almost impossible. Ryan always found a way to be nearby, and I began to suspect he was doing it on purpose. He flirted subtly, innocent jokes, light touches that made me uncomfortable yet left me eagerly waiting for the next one. I felt guilty. Every time Jason came home from work, I couldn't look him in the eye. His emotional distance, something I had grown used to, now felt like a void that Ryan was slowly beginning to fill. The internal conflict was tearing me apart. Ryan was too young for me, only 7 years younger, but still, it felt significant. His attention held something I had been missing from Jason for years. I told myself that Ryan was probably just playing with me, that this was nothing more than a game for him. But I couldn't deny how much his attention pulled me in. Every time he crossed the line, I wanted to stop him, to say no, but the words never came out. His confidence overpowered my shyness. He was like a strong current, slowly but steadily breaking down my defenses. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't push him away. There was something about this flirtation that made me feel alive, something I had been missing for so long. And the further it went, the harder it became to stop. That evening, the house felt especially empty. Jason was working late, and the silence, which usually brought me a sense of peace, now only deepened my loneliness. I sat in the living room trying to focus on a book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. He was somewhere nearby, I could feel it. My intuition, something deep inside, warned me that our next conversation could change everything. When I heard his footsteps, my heart tightened. He walked into the room with a slight smile on his face, as if he knew I was waiting for him. Without saying a word, he sat down next to me, too close. His hand brushed against mine, and in that touch there was a strange, involuntary electricity that left me feeling both fearful and drawn in. I quickly pulled my hand away, but he didn't retreat. "We're practically the same age," he said softly, leaning closer. "There's only a few years between us. You understand me, Emma, better than anyone else." His words were barely a whisper, but they carried a weight I couldn't resist. I knew it was wrong. I felt myself closing off, scared of what might come next, but my own weakness kept me from pulling away. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice faltering. "We can't." But even as I said those words, I didn't believe them myself. They sounded unconvincing, as if they were lines from a script I no longer knew how to follow. Ryan slowly inched closer, his gaze full of the confidence and intensity I had been missing in my life. In his eyes, I saw something I had been searching for: understanding, passion that Jason had never given me. His face was so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. I tried to pull away again, but my movements were slow, as if something inside me was holding me in place. Ryan didn't wait. He moved closer and our lips met. That first kiss was quiet, tentative, but I felt a tremor run through my entire body. My response was so slow, so hesitant, that it felt as though time had slowed down. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. This was a moment I had no control over, as if my whole life had decided to take a different path in that single instant. I didn't respond immediately, but after a few seconds my lips began to move in response, cautiously and trembling, as if I feared that this step could destroy everything around me. We had a tradition of dining together every evening. It was the one time of day when all of us, Jason, Ryan, and I, gathered around the table. I took pride in preparing meals for them, and seeing them enjoy the food brought me a sense of satisfaction. Even though now this ritual was overshadowed by my inner turmoil, tonight's dinner was no exception. The table was set with aromatic dishes, meat, fresh vegetables, golden rolls, everything they loved. Jason, as usual, was absorbed in his thoughts about work, but Ryan, on the other hand, did everything he could to catch my attention. He kept looking at me, his gaze too intent, too personal, which made me uncomfortable. "As always, incredible, Emma," Ryan said with a slight smile, glancing away from Jason and looking directly at me. "You're an amazing cook." I smiled, feeling a wave of anxiety inside, but I tried to hide it behind a polite nod. Jason also complimented me, though his praise was more reserved, as it always was. After dinner, Jason stood up, nodding in thanks, and headed to his room, mentioning he had some work to finish before bed. Ryan, however, remained seated, his gaze lingering on me longer than usual. When Jason left, he unexpectedly leaned in closer, his face just inches from my ear. "I'll have to thank you properly for these dinners," he whispered in a low voice, sending a chill down my spine. "Maybe one night soon." I felt my face flush with heat and my cheeks burned. I couldn't find the words to respond, only lowering my gaze as my heart raced in my chest. Everything inside me screamed that this had to stop, but I couldn't reply, neither in words nor in action. In that moment, I realized that my resistance was weakening with each of his advances. After that first kiss, Ryan didn't rush things. Everything remained slow, light touches, flirtation, hints. He moved carefully as if waiting for me to stop resisting on my own. With every step, I felt my will weakening. The tension between us was growing day by day, like a coiled spring ready to snap at any moment. One evening, when Jason was working late, we were alone again. I sat in the living room trying to focus on a book, but my mind was elsewhere. I knew he was near. Ryan approached me without warning and sat beside me on the couch. The tension in the air was palpable, almost audible. "You look special tonight," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my heart race. I looked at him, trying not to show how his words affected me. But inside it was different. Inside, a fire was burning that I couldn't control. He moved closer, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a wave of emotions through me that I wasn't prepared for. I tried to stay calm, but when his hand slid down to my sides, I could barely suppress a shiver. "This is wrong, Ryan," I whispered, my voice weak, as if I didn't believe my own words. But he already knew I wasn't resisting the way I should. I could feel his hands moving lower, and in that moment my thoughts became a chaotic mess. My head spun with surprise and desire. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't force myself to pull away. "You say it's wrong," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind, his lips close to my ear. "But you don't really resist when I do this." His hand slid down my hips, and I felt my breathing grow heavy. My heart pounded wildly, and my head was spinning from a mix of fear, guilt, and unbearable attraction. I bit my lip, feeling my knees weaken under his touch. "Ryan, don't," I whispered, trying to find strength in my voice. "Your father will be back soon." He stopped, but he still held me, his touch soft but confident. He stood behind me for another moment before slowly pulling away, but his words lingered in the air like the shadow of what had just happened. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice low and calm. "This isn't over. I know you want this, no matter how much you pretend otherwise." His words pierced through me. He saw what I had been trying to hide for so long. My modesty, my outward virtue. It was all beginning to crumble under his persistence. I felt guilty, but I couldn't stop this. Ryan knew I could no longer resist the way I once had. He saw through me, and I could no longer deny it. When Jason returned home, everything seemed perfectly normal. The three of us sat down for dinner, as if nothing had happened beyond these evenings. I looked at my husband, trying to convince myself that things could return to the way they were, but a feeling of unease lingered. Ryan sat across from me, and every time our eyes met, I felt a hidden danger. Jason, as usual, talked about work, but this time he made an unexpected suggestion. He looked at both of us and smiled. "I've been thinking, it might be nice to spend next weekend together," he said. "We'll go to the country house, relax as a family. It'll help us reconnect." Ryan, without taking his eyes off me, supported the idea. "That sounds great, Dad. I've been wanting to spend more time with both of you." A chill ran down my spine when our eyes met again. There was something in that glance that I couldn't ignore. I nodded, agreeing to Jason's suggestion, but my heart continued to beat anxiously. After dinner, Jason suddenly excused himself, explaining that he had to work late. "I need to finish a project at the office," he said, standing up from the table. "I'll go there so I don't disturb your sleep. It's all for making sure we have more time together later as a family." He kissed me goodbye and left, leaving Ryan and me alone. I sat still, feeling the tension rising again. Ryan was silent, but his gaze said more than words ever could. That night, I went to bed alone, as always. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, hoping that the darkness and silence would help me forget what was happening. But soon, I heard the door quietly open. I didn't turn, trying to ignore the approaching footsteps. My back was to the door and I pretended to be asleep. "And here I am, just as I promised," came Ryan's whisper behind me. "Time to thank you for those wonderful dinners." He slipped into bed beside me, his hands slowly tracing my body. I tensed, but my thoughts were too tangled to resist. His touch became more insistent, exploring every curve. I felt the tension between us build, a mix of desire and fear. Everything was happening so fast that my thoughts couldn't keep up. What I didn't know was that when I had my back to him, Ryan had slipped into the room and set up a hidden camera. It was placed discreetly to capture everything that was about to unfold. When he finally got what he wanted, our bodies entwined in a moment of passion. I couldn't stop it. My head spun with guilt and desire, and I didn't understand how things had gone this far. Ryan did what he wanted and left me lying in the dark, my thoughts tearing me apart. Later that night, Ryan sent the video to Mark. He knew his friend would appreciate the victory. The next day they met, and Ryan, proud of himself, bragged to Mark about how he was in control. "She's completely lost it," Ryan said with a smirk. "You should have seen it. Weak, obedient. She's in my hands." Mark enjoyed it. He encouraged Ryan, urging him to continue, to savor this forbidden passion and his control over his father's wife. A few days passed, and outwardly our lives seemed calm and ordinary. Ryan, as usual, found ways to be near me, and when there was an opportunity, we spent time together. I knew our behavior was dangerous, that one day it could all come crashing down, but I couldn't stop. One morning, Ryan stayed in his room longer than usual. Jason, accustomed to his son being more organized and active, began to worry. It was already well past noon, but Ryan still hadn't stirred. Watching his son, Jason felt a strange unease. Ryan wasn't the type to be so idle, to lose focus on his responsibilities. Something was off. When Jason knocked on the door and received no response, he decided to enter the room. Ryan was still asleep. Jason felt an unsettling dissatisfaction. He was used to seeing his son more in control and responsible. A suspicion began to grow inside him, that Ryan was leading a double life or hiding something important. He glanced around the room and noticed Ryan's phone on the bedside table. He hesitated at first, but then decided to pick it up. Maybe this would give him some insight into what was going on. As he browsed through the messages, Jason wasn't expecting to find anything unusual, until he came across a conversation with Mark. His brow furrowed as he saw a video file attached. He tapped the file, and what unfolded on the screen left him in shock. The video was from that night when Ryan came into my room. I was lying with my back to the door, unaware of what was happening behind me. Ryan, as always confident, was doing things I couldn't stop, not knowing we were being filmed. Jason's face turned to stone as he stared at the screen. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. His own son had betrayed him in the most brutal way possible. The shock welled up in his chest. This wasn't just an affair. This was something much deeper and more terrifying. Jason realized that his son had coldly manipulated me and used me for his own pleasure. This was a game Ryan had entered, knowing it would destroy not only me, but Jason as well. The video was undeniable proof that Ryan had control over me, and I, without fully realizing it, had become a victim of his manipulation. But Jason knew he couldn't just explode in anger. He had to carefully plan his actions. Slowly, he placed the phone back where he had found it, careful not to betray his emotions. He had to think through every step, not just to uncover the full truth, but to figure out how to deal with this betrayal. He left the room, his face calm, but inside he was seething. This was more than just a blow, it was a disaster, and he had to be methodical in handling it. Acting rashly could ruin everything. Jason understood that in this situation he needed to be cold and calculated, to make both Ryan and Emma reveal their true selves. He couldn't allow his emotions to take control. Too much was at stake. At first, everything seemed normal. Jason gave no indication that anything had changed. He remained kind to me, smiling as always, and spoke to me about his plans for the future. Ryan acted just as confidently as ever. But slowly, I started to sense that something wasn't right. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was tension in the air. It was as though Jason knew something I couldn't read in his eyes. Sometimes I caught him studying me too closely, as if he was trying to see through me. But each time I told myself it was just my own anxiety getting the better of me. I was afraid that my secret might be discovered, and that fear seemed to taint every moment. When Ryan was around, I felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. But even he began to sense that something was off. One evening, while we were alone, he shot me a tense look and asked, "Have you noticed that Dad's been acting weird lately?" I felt a surge of panic. If Ryan was picking up on it too, maybe my suspicions weren't baseless, but I brushed off his words, trying to downplay the situation. "You're just overthinking it," I said, trying to convince not only him but myself as well. "He's just tired. He's been working a lot." But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next few days, I started noticing small details that had previously escaped me. Jason began asking me questions that seemed harmless but made me uneasy. He also left me and Ryan alone more often than usual, as if he was testing what we would do. And in those moments, when I felt I was on the verge of being found out, the tension was unbearable. Ryan, too, began to grow more nervous. Sometimes it seemed like he was getting frustrated with me for no apparent reason. The confidence in him that I had once admired was starting to crack. Small arguments began to arise between us, disagreements over things that seemed trivial, but in reality they were driven by deeper mistrust that began to fester. I kept telling myself that everything could be fixed, that I just needed to stay calm and not let the fear take over. But Jason was masterfully provoking doubt in both of us. There was nothing obvious in his words or actions, but I could feel him pulling the strings, manipulating us like a puppeteer. One evening at dinner, Jason suddenly brought up the topic of trust in a family, how important it is to be honest with each other. I felt my heart freeze in my chest. Was this a hint? Did he know? I glanced at Ryan, and the same fear I felt was mirrored in his eyes. But Jason continued speaking calmly and confidently, giving no indication that he knew anything specific. After that dinner, I retreated to my room, feeling my anxiety intensify. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jason knew more than he was letting on. But why wasn't he acting? Why wasn't he confronting us? His silence only deepened the tension between me and Ryan. We began to suspect each other more and more, as though each of us feared the other would make a mistake and reveal everything. Every day became an agonizing wait for the inevitable. I could no longer sleep peacefully. Jason's manipulation was subtle but powerful, and it felt as though he was watching, waiting to see how long we could hold out before we cracked. Jason began to act. His plan wasn't just to expose us. No, he decided to destroy us from within. Quietly, methodically, he started playing with our emotions, manipulating both of us until our own fears and doubts began eating us alive. I noticed that he began paying more attention to me, as if nothing had changed between us. He was tender, talking to me like before, hugging me in front of Ryan or joking about our shared memories. But all of it felt staged, and I sensed it. I couldn't understand what was happening, but the tension only grew. Every time Jason was close to me, I could see Ryan's face darken with jealousy. It infuriated him, and his aggression began to surface. One night, after another dinner with Jason, Ryan suddenly exploded when we were alone. "You're using me, Emma," he spat, his eyes full of rage. "You just like feeling better about yourself with me, but in the end, you still go back to him." His accusations hit me like a blow, and I didn't know how to react. I was so weakened by my own emotions that his words stung deeply. But I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was he suddenly so angry? Why had his frustration become so obvious? "Ryan, that's not true." I tried to calm him, but my words came out too weak. "You're misunderstanding." "I understand perfectly, Emma. You're just playing me," he continued, not listening to a word I said. A wall of mutual accusations began to grow between us. Everything I said only fueled his anger. My confusion kept me from seeing what was really going on, and the more I tried to understand, the deeper I sank into this twisted game. And Jason? He saw everything. It was as if he relished watching us tear each other apart. He deliberately put us in situations where his presence would provoke Ryan's jealousy and frustration. He did it skillfully, not too overtly, but enough for Ryan to slowly lose control over himself. With each passing day, the tension between Ryan and me only grew worse. We stopped trusting each other. His words and accusations became unbearable. I felt that the bond we once shared was crumbling before my eyes. And Jason, watching it all, began to reveal his true intentions. One night, during another family dinner, when Ryan tried to say something, Jason suddenly cut him off. "Maybe you should think about what's really happening before you start blaming others," Jason said, looking directly at Ryan with a slight smirk. That remark hit the mark. Ryan turned red with anger, his fists clenched, but he couldn't find the words. Jason continued, "Perhaps you're lacking something," he said, subtly hinting at Ryan's weakness, his inability to control himself and his life. I could see how deeply this humiliated him. After that, Ryan couldn't hold back anymore. His rage exploded, and for the first time I saw him like that, broken, aggressive, and it was all the result of the game Jason had pulled us into. Jason, cold and calculating, was ready to deliver his final blow. He chose a moment when we were alone at home, and I couldn't anticipate what was about to happen. His tone was calm when he asked to talk, but the moment I saw the look on his face, I knew something had happened. "I know," he began, his voice neither angry nor pained, just ice-cold calm. "I know about your affair with Ryan." I froze, my heart pounding in my throat. Everything I had tried so hard to keep hidden had finally come to light. But it was his next words that truly shook me. "You have no idea how far this has gone," he continued, looking me straight in the eye. "Ryan's been showing videos of your meetings to his friends." I felt everything inside me collapse. It was like a blow I could never recover from. I looked at Jason, but all I could feel was pain and shame. Ryan had shown videos to others? Everything that had happened between us had become a topic of discussion and pride for his friends. I felt utterly humiliated. I was a toy in Ryan's hands, and now I could see it clearly. "To him, you were just a game," Jason continued. "And now that I know, it's over between us too." I couldn't look him in the eye anymore. Everything that had happened between me and Ryan now felt not just like a betrayal of Jason, but a betrayal of myself. I felt used, discarded, like everything I had once thought was important had been an illusion. "I loved you for your modesty and shyness," Jason said, coldly evaluating me with his eyes. "For being quiet, serious, loyal, but now none of that remains. You've destroyed everything, and my feelings for you are gone too." His words were like knives cutting deep into my heart. All I was left with was a profound sense of humiliation and disgust with myself. Jason was right. I had destroyed everything. I had lost his love and his respect. Later that day, when Ryan came in, he was no longer the confident man I had known. His face was tense, as if he already knew what was coming. Jason was waiting for him with a cold smile. "You think this is just a game, Ryan?" Jason said. "You think I didn't know what you were doing?" Ryan froze, his confidence evaporating in an instant. He tried to say something, but Jason didn't give him the chance. "I know everything. All your little games, all your videos. You've destroyed everything you had. Now you have neither me nor Emma. You thought you were in control? Now you've lost it all." Ryan tried to explain himself, but his words didn't matter. I saw that he had lost all respect, not just from Jason, but from me too. His attempts at justification seemed pathetic, and in that moment he was no longer the person I had once known. His sense of superiority was gone, and with it, any hope for our future. I couldn't stay with him anymore. Everything between us had been completely destroyed. I turned away from Ryan, realizing that now I was alone, and because of our mistakes, everything we had was reduced to ashes. After the truth came to light, everything fell apart so quickly that I barely had time to comprehend how my world shattered into pieces. Jason filed for divorce. His decision was final and uncompromising. He didn't yell, he didn't cause a scene. He simply explained coldly that our marriage was over. I could see in his eyes that he felt nothing for me anymore, just cold disgust. "You've destroyed everything," he said quietly, but with a force that cut through me to my core. "I thought you were different. Quiet, loyal, modest. That's what I loved about you. But now, none of that is left." I couldn't find the words. My entire life, everything that I once believed to be real disappeared in an instant. I was shattered. Guilt and shame burned inside me. I had lost not only my marriage, but everything I once valued. my modesty, my loyalty, my dignity. Ryan, he was thrown out as well. When Jason kicked him out of the house, it was just as cold as everything else. Ryan tried to explain, to justify himself, but Jason gave him no chance. "You thought you could carry on with my wife behind my back and come out of it without consequences?" Jason said icily. "Now you'll have to make your own way in life since you think you're so clever." Jason blocked all of Ryan's accounts, cutting off his financial support. I watched as Ryan lost all his confidence. He looked lost, bewildered. Everything that had once made him so self-assured was gone. His arrogance had crumbled, just like our future together. I was left alone, completely alone. In the house where I once felt like an outsider, then found some semblance of comfort, there was now no place for me. Everything between Jason and me had been destroyed. Ryan had used me, betrayed me, and I had allowed it to happen. Now I had to face the consequences of my mistakes. Jason, cold and calculating, watched our downfall. He saw us crumble, and it seemed to bring him a sense of moral satisfaction. I realized that this wasn't the first betrayal he had experienced. His first wife, Ryan's mother, had once betrayed him, and since then, he had hardened himself against such blows. Now, with this betrayal, he didn't suffer as much as he had before. He simply did what he thought was necessary, rid himself of those who had betrayed him and left us with nothing. My heart was broken, and I didn't know how to move forward. Everything I had ever held dear had been destroyed. I had lost myself. After Jason threw me out of the house, I didn't know what to do. I felt like a ship without a captain, stranded on the shore. Lost and broken, I realized the only place I could return to was my hometown, the place I had left behind to start a new life with Jason. Now I had to go back there to rediscover myself. I went back to my old job at the small library, where everything was familiar and predictable. The quiet hours spent among the bookshelves gave me time to think, to reflect on myself. Each day, I returned home to an empty, silent space. And though at first that silence felt unbearable, gradually, I began to see it as a necessary part of my healing process. The first weeks were the hardest. I kept blaming myself for everything that had happened. I had lost the husband I once loved and ruined my life because of my involvement with Ryan. The guilt was crushing. But soon I realized that if I wanted to find a way forward, I had to stop living in the past. I had to learn to forgive myself for my mistakes. Slowly, step by step, I started working on myself. I realized that my weakness, my shyness, and my timidity had played a key role in how everything unfolded. I had always suppressed my desires for the sake of others, afraid to speak up for myself. This had made me vulnerable to Ryan's manipulation. He had taken advantage of my insecurity, of my desperate need for emotional closeness. I came to understand that what I had thought was love for Ryan was an illusion. It wasn't real love. It was just a need for attention, for someone to see something more in me. I had been seeking in him what I lacked in myself, and once I realized this, the pain began to fade. Forgiving myself was not easy. I revisited every moment, every decision, and analyzed them over and over. I had to accept that I had made mistakes, but that didn't make me a bad person. I began working on being strong, not for anyone else, but in myself. Each day, I learned something new about who I was, about how my fears and insecurities had controlled me, about how my shyness wasn't a flaw, but it also wasn't an excuse to let others manipulate me. I started finding new purposes in life, small steps that helped me move forward. I was no longer the timid woman afraid to express her feelings. I began to find my voice, my place in the world where I no longer depended on the opinions of others. This journey was long, but I knew I was heading in the right direction. Forgiving myself became the key to my new beginning. I no longer looked back with bitterness. Instead, I saw a future ahead of me where I could be strong, confident, and free. Jason didn't stop with the simple destruction of our lives. His cold, meticulously planned revenge continued. He decided that Ryan deserved even harsher consequences for his betrayal. Jason used all his connections to ensure that Ryan couldn't find a job or get any support. Every door Ryan knocked on was slammed shut, and it was no accident. Jason was systematically destroying all of his chances, and for Ryan, it was a downfall he hadn't anticipated. Ryan wrote to me desperate. His message was filled with bitterness and fear. "It's Dad. He's destroying me. Every company refuses me the moment they find out who I am. I have nothing left, Emma. Please help me. I don't know what to do." I didn't know how to respond. I often stared at his words, thinking that we both deserved these consequences. Everything that happened was the result of our own choices. And while I felt some sympathy for Ryan, I understood that Jason was doing what he believed was right. This was his justice. I was no longer part of his life, and I didn't judge him for what he was doing. He was simply giving us what we deserved. However, Jason didn't stop there. He tried to destroy me as well by attacking my job, but I found out about it thanks to a call from my boss. Jason had tried to use his connections to take away the last bit of security I had left. Fortunately, my father was a close friend of my boss, and Jason's attempt failed. It was a surprising stroke of luck that he wasn't able to deal another blow to my life. I realized that Jason was fully consumed by his revenge. His thirst for justice and punishment for those who had betrayed him had become a part of his life. But I couldn't blame him. This entire process of destruction was his way of dealing with the pain, and he was doing what he felt was necessary. His revenge was complete, and I understood that it had not only destroyed us but him as well. In the end, I knew I had to move on. I was no longer part of this cycle of vengeance and destruction. I didn't try to reclaim anything from the past, nor did I blame Jason for what he was doing. He was following his sense of justice. But I knew I couldn't stay in that life any longer. As I left, I no longer felt pain or regret. I forgave myself and everyone involved in this story. All of this had been a lesson, and now I could start a new life, free from the past and free from the pain.